Good morning, everybody. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder of the Parent Education Series and co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. With me here today also is my partner, Bev Hartman, who will be putting links in the chat. If you would like Spanish interpretation, we have with us interpreter Cynthia Hinestrosa, and you can go to the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a globe icon. So if you want to, again, hear Spanish, click on the globe and then Spanish. The rest of you can click on English or just stay with us in your regular channel. First of all, I want to say that we're very excited. This is the first in a series of authors event, and we could not be more thrilled to have with us author and memoirist Emily Rapp Black, whose book I read and devoured, which was wonderful. And I was telling Emily today, I think that I read about 10 pages when I emailed her and said, I love it. I think that there's so much relevant information to talk about parents. And she emailed me back, which was amazing. That never happened. So we're just so grateful for her generosity and for her being with us today. Before I tell you a little bit more about Emily, I want to say a special thank you to our sponsors, the Sequoia Healthcare District, Peninsula Healthcare District, Sequoia Union High School District, and the Parent Venture. We would not be here without your generous support. So thank you again. And also special thanks to our special guest today, Emily Rapp, because she is here. Today, we're going to be just really taking your questions, and I'll be asking some questions that I've developed in the reading of her two books. So I'll tell you about her again in just a second. So we're going to be having questions. We would like you to use the Q&A button for your questions. Love to have that. If you have comments to each other, to us, please put that in the chat. And then also Bev will be putting links to Emily's books and other relevant information. So look for that, comments in the chat, questions in the Q&A if you would. This event will be recorded and available on our video library. We know that that has become a trusted resource for you all with about 15,000 video views, including 12,000 since COVID. So again, free video library, that's our YouTube channel. Our next event is coming up on Tuesday, April 13th at 5:30 with Dr. Ronan McGinn. Some of you know him as a featured parent forum presenter. His talk is called How to Have a Better Relationship with Your Child or Teen. I think we all need that. And he specifically will be focusing on parent-child communication. All right, let me tell you a little bit today about our keynote author. Emily Rapp Black is the author of Poster Child and Memoir, The Still Point of the Turning World, which was a New York Times bestseller, Sanctuary, a memoir published in January 21, and her latest book, Frida Kahlo and My Left Leg, which will be published in June of this year. A former Fulbright scholar, she was educated at Harvard University, Trinity College Dublin, St. Olaf College in Minnesota, and the University of Texas, Austin, where she was a James A. Michener Fellow. A Guggenheim Fellow, Emily has received awards and fellowships from the Rona Jaffe Foundation, the Gentle Arts Foundation, the Corporation of Yaddo, the Fine Arts Work Center, Fundación Valparaiso, and Bucknell University. Her work has appeared in Vogue, the New York Times, the Times London, Time, the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, the Oprah Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, and other publications and anthologies. Please join me in a really warm welcome for Emily Rapp Black.
Thank you.
So Emily, I want to start with one of the things that most struck me about your book and the story of your son. And first of all, just from all of us, we want to say how sorry we are for your loss. He was a beautiful little boy, and I think he's really doing a lot to teach us. So that's why we're here today. Thank you to Ronan, and thank you to you. So many parents, especially today, and especially here in Silicon Valley, are really concerned about the future of their children, finding the right preschool, making the right traveling team, getting into a good college. What did you learn through the process of parenting without a future? What does that mean to you?
So that's a really good question. First, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the invite. Always love to talk about my son. I feel like the short answer to that is that it doesn't really matter. I mean, that sounds awful, but of course it matters because you want your child to have a future that's, optimal, where they're happy. But for me, having a son that I knew wouldn't live beyond 3 and wouldn't be able to do anything, it really upended my ideas about ambition. And as a very ambitious person, as a very sort of go-getter, it was hard for me to do that. And that was a lesson. I mean, I hesitate to use that word because I don't want to say like my son taught me lessons, because literally I would have preferred to learn that lesson like any other way, but that's the way I learned it. And so I thank him for that. I think, I just want my kid, my living child, to live. I want her to live and be happy. And I literally don't have any attachment to how much money she makes, or where she goes to college, if she goes to college. Like, I just want her to be happy and enjoy her life and find meaningful things to do. And that might not be the things that I find meaningful. And they might, I mean, who knows? Kids are their own people. So I just, she's good at some things, so she has lessons in those things, but I just am never going to be that person, that parent who's like, I can't do it. Because when I do, it's just not going to happen. I'm just not going to push her to do anything that she's really resistant to. That doesn't mean I'm not going to, instill discipline. I mean, I think she is a disciplined kid. I want her to have a work ethic, but if she wants to, spend her life as a forest ranger or a CEO, or doesn't want to go to college, that's fine with me. I just want her to be happy. And I want to die before she does. Those are my goals.
Those are your goals. Fair enough. So Emily, for those of you who may not be familiar with your book, would you mind giving us like a little overview of the still point?
Mm-hmm. So the still point of the turning world is a quote from a T.S. Eliot poem. And it's basically the notion of it is that when you or someone you love receives a terminal diagnosis, time kind of collapses. It's like, there's a single time, and then all of the times and memories and future is sort of in one moment. So there's time is sort of everything and nothing at all. And what that does to time is it makes us sort of stop, because you literally stop and say like, what next, right? And so Ronan, my son, was diagnosed with Tay-Sachs disease when he was 9 months old. I was tested for Tay-Sachs, although I'm not Jewish. And the test came back fine because they only tested for 7 of the mutations. So there are 100 plus mutations of Tay-Sachs that you have to specifically request if you want to have all your bases covered. And of course, I had no idea and had no way of knowing that. So I did get tested. People often ask me that, and it's like, yep. And even if I hadn't, it still wouldn't matter. So he was diagnosed when he was 9 months old. He died about a month before he turned 3. And during the time he was living, I was ferociously writing, and I was angry, and I was grieving, and I was, just on fire, because I didn't want to just like sink into the tragedy hole. I wanted to find some kind of meaning in what was happening to me. And it turns out there was a lot to be had. So it taught me a lot. I mean, it definitely forged me as a person, probably more significantly than anything else that I've ever experienced. And so he would have been 11 in March, which is weird. Like, that's like a totally different person. So that's kind of the story. And the arc of the story, or the sort of narrative, is the daily kind of wrangling with the issues that came up around parenting and other people's reactions to my situation, which were sometimes the hardest to manage. So like my next book that I'm working on now is called I Would Die If I Were You, which so many people said to me, and I was just like, that is not okay. Like, I just think that's the worst thing to say to someone. Like, it sounds like a suggestion, and it's also not true. Like, your kids are your kids. Like, they come as they are, and part of the job of a parent is to love them through whatever that is. And I just think that the whole notion that, if you have a kid that's going to die, that you would just die too. I mean, of course you probably want to, and I certainly did sometimes, but you probably wouldn't.
So Emily, my mom was Canadian. She died when I was 18. She was a big part of my life. She loved babies. Her second child died at 6 weeks of leukemia. And I remember her telling me when I was a little girl that the doctor said to her, if it had to happen to anyone, Virginia, I'm glad it was you. And people have said to me, what a terrible thing to say. And I'm like, no, I think he was acknowledging that she could and would get through it.
Mm.
Would you have preferred to hear that over people saying, I'd die if that happened to me, or I'm so sorry for you?
Um, Truthfully, that was something that I bristled against as well, just because I feel like I have, as a young person, I'd already been through quite a bit. And so the implication, and I totally see what the doctor was saying to her. I think it's meant to be an encouraging thing. And I think in some ways it is. Um, but what I feel like is that saying like someone who's already kind of built to withstand just gets more and more and more. And it seems like enough now, right? But definitely more helpful than if I would die if I were you. What I wanted people to say to me when Ronan was living was, will you tell me about him? That's literally what I wanted people to ask. Not like, oh, how are you still standing, or why are you still alive, or, my personal favorite, not seeing you puts my life into perspective. Like, don't say that. I just wanted someone to ask me about him because he was my kid. It's like the way people interact with my daughter now, who's adorable and precocious and cute and funny and super outgoing. And people are always asking me about her, but she's like the most neurotypical sort of child you can imagine. She's very just normal, whatever that means. So yeah, I just wanted someone to ask me about him. That's all I wanted.
That's really interesting. I watched Anderson Cooper, who has such a nice way interviewing people. And when someone has lost someone, that's his question. Can you tell me about them? And I always was struck by how that's what people want, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So how do you keep Ronan alive for his sister?
So what I do with her, she knows that she kind of gets it. She's 7, right? I mean, she's not gonna, kids don't really get it. Like that, they're not imagining like the loss of a future or what happened in the past. They're very present minded. But she knows that he died. We don't say passed away. We don't say gone to heaven. We say died. And she uses that word, and she likes to tell people that. And it's a little bit like off-putting, I think, to people, but I like that. It's a frankness. So I always tell her, like, when he has a birthday, we usually, do mark it or talk about it. And, the day that he died is Valentine's Day, like between Valentine's Day and the 15th. And so she knows that's a kind of a hard day for me. And we talk about what it means to love. And, she sometimes feels sad that he's not here. And I think it's just through pictures and talking and memory. I mean, memory is what connects the past and the present and the future. I mean, Arthur Frankl talks about that in Man's Search for Meaning. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be something that she'll think about as she grows older, that she probably won't fully understand until then. And that's okay. I think she understands it enough for her sort of developmental phase.
That makes sense. So early on, you write, shortly after Ronan's diagnosis, you said, how do you parent without a future knowing that you will lose your child? Could it even be called parenting, or was it something else? Now that you've had time to think about it, how do you answer that question?
I definitely think it's parenting. I mean, parenting to me now in my current situation or current iteration is like responding to need, being honest, making sure she's healthy and safe, being the sort of mama bear. And that's what I did with Ronan. It was the same thing. It's just that the stakes were higher and the activities were different. So, for now, Charlie's like, I got to get her to school. I got to pack her lunch. She has, lessons, these things that have to happen. And she's to go to bed. She's to have a bath. Like, she kind of kicks back on me on some of those things, but Ronan didn't, obviously. But with Ronan, it was like, medications and, machines and all those things that had to be sort of, calculated and titrated in time. And so it's not so dissimilar. It's just that it was, definitely sad. So, parenting Charlie is fun. It's also sometimes really annoying, right? Because kids are hard, but it's also, what parents do. So yeah, I would say it's definitely parenting. And I think that, we do have this very kind of tenacious notion, especially in American culture, where you must achieve to like be a worthy person. And I just think that's patently ridiculous. Like it, anyone who's alive is valuable. Everyone's life is valuable. It doesn't, just because someone isn't going to become like, a physicist and like, I don't know, cure cancer, doesn't mean that they're not of value or they don't have things to share with us and teach us, even if they can't speak.
Boy, is that true. One of the reasons I started this program was to give parents a voice, because so often in school settings, parents don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, we live in communities where success is a really big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And we have, sort of the Silicon Valley fail fast thing. And I don't happen to believe that either of those things are good for children. So I'm even on the board of an organization called Challenge Success at Stanford, Emily, where it's all about transforming schools so that kids can better define success on their terms. Mm-hmm. And you write a lot about that. After your experience parenting, Ronan, how do you define success? How did that change you? Because as you say, you were the March of Dimes poster child. You had survived so much. You were a person of great energy, it seems like, and achievement. So how did that still point change things?
Well, I'm still that person. I just am less attached to the outcome. Like I still have a lot of energy. I'm still quite ambitious, but I don't mark my value by external success anymore because it's an inside job.
It's an inside job. I like that.
Yeah. Like, so the work I did with Ronan, like a lot of it was alone. I was alone with him, and no one was going to give me a star, which is fine. I didn't want a star. I wanted a cure for Tay-Sachs, which didn't happen. But, yeah, I sort of, and I think it's a function of getting older. And I also think it's a function of COVID. Like to me, like a successful day in COVID is like, at least half the dishes are done. And like, everyone's going to bed before 10. And like, it's just like the priorities get shifted. With the change is constant in our lives, right? The priorities always have to shift. So I think successful parenting is just being present and showing up. Like, I don't think kids don't respond to, like my parents didn't pressure me to do anything. Like they were like, okay, well, this is also a different time. This is in the 70s and 80s where we could just leave the house and be gone until dinner, and no one was going to think twice. We weren't overscheduled. We weren't, we didn't get any extra tutoring. We went to a school that was like not that great. It was basically like some concrete in a field. And like, there was not a lot of like robust educational sort of standards. And I'm fine. Like, I don't think that that's what it is. Like, I think what it was for me is that my parents really loved me. I drove them up the wall. That's for sure. I was definitely the problem child, and that's okay. I own that. But I didn't ever feel like whatever I would do, I thought would be okay, even if it wasn't okay. And I have this funny story. My dad, so when I was in high school, a terrible high school, like just, I could have never gone to class and graduated like at the top. So I was this awful. I probably shouldn't admit this, but I think it's really funny. I would charge people money to write their essays and their sonnets. So it was like $5 a sonnet, $10 an essay. And I had this like wad of cash, like in my room. My dad came in, he's like, "Are you a drug dealer?" And I was like, "No." He's like, "Well, why do you have this money?" I was like, "I have a job." And he's like, "Doing what?" "You're 15. And I told him, and he's like, "You have to stop doing that. It's totally unethical." So I did, but I made some money in the process. So, I think it's, my parents are really proud of me, but they were not like tiger parents by any means, partly because they didn't have any money. And secondly, they just were like, "Yay, she's happy and alive. Let's just be glad about that." And I grew up in an intergenerational community as well. And I think that that was the only diversity there was, but that was significant, I think.
And how so, Emily? I grew up without grandparents, so I never got to know any of them.
Oh.
How did that help you? I was really struck by how you write about your parents and how they just seem like a really pivotal relationship for you.
Yeah, they definitely are. Well, I knew my grandmother, who was not a very kind person. And I never knew my mom's parents because they died very young. But my dad was a Lutheran minister. And so in a church setting, like there are, we used to call them shut-ins, right? Because they couldn't leave their house, like such a bad term. So, people who were like, dad would take communion to them, or he would go visit them and I would go with him because, no one did babysitters back then, or my parents didn't. And so, I just got to know a lot of the older people in the church through the ritualistic things that you do in church and the meals. And I really, from a very young age, really, really liked spending time with older people. And I felt like they had a lot of things to say and teach me. And also I was in a body cast for like a lot of those years. So I wasn't actually have any friends that we could play with. So I would go and hang out with Edith, and she would knit things and talk to me. And, it was just like, kids they just figure it out. They don't know any different, so they just figure it out. And it was like completely happy childhood, even though I had a lot of physical stuff to deal with. I was happy. I was a happy kid.
I think that's great. My longtime best friend, Joanna, if you're on, hi, is also the daughter of a Lutheran pastor from Minnesota who went to St. Olaf. So I understand that part of you, Emily. I do. She also has great facility with people, and especially seniors, and I admire that. I think it really matters.
Yeah, it does matter. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your perspective on how every child has value, no matter their physical or mental state.
Well, I think this gets back to the kind of the idea of life. Life is an accident. Once it's in the world, it sort of needs to be cherished. I don't know. I just think we have this notion that achievement means value, or whatever that looks like to individuals. Yeah. And it's just not true. It's just not true. And Ronan was the kind of, obviously didn't do anything. He couldn't see, couldn't speak. He had no physical sort of abilities at the end of his life. And I would take him places in his, his carrier with all his stuff, and people would like come into his presence and just cry because he was so peaceful. Like, even with all the crap that was going on, he was just like a Buddha. They called him my friend used to call him the Buddha baby. And he just had this like enlightened vibe. Like he had to, have a horrible illness in order to get that enlightened vibe. So I would say it's not worth it in the balance, but that is like the energy that he had, just complete like silence and contentment, even though he couldn't do anything. So there's a lesson there, or there's I don't know if lesson is the right word, but there's something to take from that that's kind of universally true, and that all of us have, something like that inside of us.
So people picked up on that by being in his presence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did. He was just, I took him everywhere. I was like, I don't care if people are uncomfortable with this stuff. Like, he's my kid and we're going to brunch. I actually once took him to a nightclub because he could hear. That's like the last sense to go. And, it was like a country like dance thing, and like all these people are dancing around him, and he was kind of like, sort of cooing and like, like, who's my crazy mom? But I don't know. I just think I tried to give him experiences that were sensory, because that was really the only way for him to have experiences. Yeah, and make sure he was comfortable, because if you can't move, you have to like figure out you have to make sure that you're moving the child around because they can't move themselves.
That's so interesting. I once got to see the Dalai Lama in person at Stanford inside the basketball arena, which was really cool. But someone asked him a question about, how do you deal with all the suffering in the world? And through his interpreter, he replied, it is what it is. And I thought, that's it. That's the message, right? It is what it is. So that has always stayed with me. And it's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah.
There's this still point, right? So Emily, your book is magnificently woven through with literary references. That was one of my favorite parts for all of our readers and lovers of books. I actually studied at college with someone who was a James Joyce and T.S. Eliot expert, so he loves the title of your book.
That's awesome.
How did literature underpin this journey for you? Did it help you?
Oh yeah, in every way. I've always been like an avid reader. It's why I became a writer. Story shapes everything I think about. It's how I see the world, or experience the world rather. And that started also in childhood with Bible stories, which I used to rewrite, give to my dad. Like, that's not how they end. I'm like, why not? So I think, yeah, storytelling is a powerful tool for transformation. It's a powerful tool of framing our world. It may be the only tool, in my opinion, and because everyone's kind of a natural storyteller. If we have a life, we have a story. And so, when Ronan was diagnosed, I was like, help poets. I mean, I just like pulled off. I mean, I would randomly go to my shelf and just pull stuff down and start reading it. And of course, in this sort of heightened state of grief and rage and everything had a meaning to me. Like things that I had reread like 20 years before were suddenly like, sparkling with meaning. And so what I liked about that was actually really helpful to me, because the truth about it is that many millions of people have lost children since the beginning of time. Like it's not something that was, impossible, right? Of course, it feels impossible in our world because we have all these things in place that make it seem impossible, but of course it's possible. So I definitely went to literature because I felt like in literature, we see how suffering is framed and how framing suffering makes it bearable. It doesn't make it better, but it makes it bearable. And I think that's, yeah, I mean, I think that's always been what I do, like for escape, for stimulation. Like the life of the mind is like, for me, the biggest support that's like I can hold in my body. It's just like that's where I go when I'm upset. So yeah, and I also wanted to say, and I believe this is true, that like every story that's ever been told, that hasn't been told, that won't be told, that might be told, that is told, is in conversation with another story across time and history. Like it's just no storyteller is out there like on a standing alone on a mountain telling a story. Like we're all linked. All the stories are linked. So that's another reason why I love to pull in other writers and thinkers, because I feel like it's a conversation inside the book, regardless of what the book creates conversations other places, that's important too, but inside the book is a conversation as well.
That is really beautifully said, Emily. I'm thinking about my partner, Bev Hartman, writes about relationships and storytelling in terms of teaching young children. And I'm sure you'd agree that is how we teach kids about life and about family, right? Is through storytelling.
Oh yeah. I mean, and even, so when my daughter, obviously I have an artificial leg. So my daughter's like, what's this deal? And so I was telling her about it. And then I went to her school once. She read a Frida Kahlo book. And so they were doing self-portraits and I brought one of my prosthetics, and oh my God, she was like, my mom was the coolest person. Like and I was like reading the book and they were asking me questions, and it's just like, yeah, I mean, they're curious, and then they would ask me questions that were like so much more advanced than like adults would.
Yeah.
Just, like cool questions. Like I get asked a lot of dumb questions by, adult people, and like kids never ask dumb questions. And I don't know if it's the intent or it's just they just are so literal or imaginative. I don't know, but it was such a fun day. And I was just like, oh, I hope they remember this. Like in their lives, like people have different bodies and it's okay. And like you don't need to be afraid of it. You can ask questions.
I think that's awesome, Emily. I started my career teaching little kids at Big Nursery School at Stanford, laboratory preschool for the psych department. And I never tired of it. 31 kids a day, I never tired of it. But my favorite thing was the Stanford community would be doing research, right? One year, the kids dubbed the researchers the sillies because they thought their questions were so dumb.
That's awesome.
We're talking famous researchers like Walter Mischel and Albert.
Yeah, that's like bring it down a notch.
Exactly. So the kids had their own community around it. I just thought that was really fun.
Yeah, they're so funny what they come up with. It's just so great.
They totally are. So this is back to the parenting questions again. At one point in the book, Emily, you ask, what does it mean to be a good parent or to live a meaningful life? Do you think there is such a thing as being a good parent? And how do you feel about sort of the research around the good enough parent? I have conflicted feelings about that phrase.
I mean, practically, in terms of just like, I don't believe in like hitting your kids. Like, I think some people still kind of subscribe to this, corporal punishment, like, I don't know what that's about. No, I say no to that. I think to be a good parent, you really have to love your kid, even when they are making you banana pants, and like, even when they're difficult, even when they are sick. And that's really the bottom line. And it sounds so simplistic, like it is what it is. I'm certainly not the Dalai Lama, but I do think it's, you know, I have some friends who've gone through the foster care system and they've adopted kids, and you know, there's just so many kids are abused and neglected and just treated like horribly, which is disgusting and sickening, and has worsened in COVID, in fact, because they're trapped in the house with their abuser parents or whatever. And I mean, I guess I just think it's hard to imagine that level of neglect of a kid. It's just really hard for you to imagine that. So I feel like, you know, no hitting, no blaming, no gaslighting, no lying, and just love, like, you know, saying I love you a lot, which I think is something that my parents didn't do that. I mean, I definitely felt it, but they were, you know, they're Protestants. What are you gonna do? You know, like Swedish Protestants, there's just not a lot of like, you know, explosive love statements. But I tell Charlie all the time, like, I love you, like every day, multiple times a day, because I feel like that has to land somewhere. It matters. And some friends of mine who did foster a child, who then, you know, I think was she went to another place, is like the happiest kid in the foster home because her first year was so full of love, right? Before cognition, before not cognition, but before like speech, before anything, she just felt it.
Yeah, yeah, so true. So Emily, one of the things that really struck me again that you mentioned in the book is that parents with dying kids have insights into parenting that are hard won, but they're very seldom asked for parenting advice. I'm asking you today for parenting advice because I think whether you call it lessons learned or whatever, you really do have something important to say to parents. It reminds me of working with families in the addiction community. I learned a lot from them, you know, staying in your own lane. There's no such thing as hitting the bottom. People have to make decisions for themselves. So why do you think that is? Why do people not come to moms like you for advice?
Well, that's a
good question.
It's a good question. And I wish they would. Like, I run a group that's ever expanding. In fact, it's a writing through child loss group for women. And we've been together, our group has grown in the last year, and we've been together about 2 years. And we're from all over, all sort of socioeconomic, all sort of ethnic backgrounds, all parts of the world or the country. And, you know, that group is so wise in this like way that isn't pretentious. Like we laugh so much about things that aren't funny in that group. It's so great. And, you know, we also, we get some kind of, I don't know, when you've been through that particular crucible, like you really understand what matters, and you become, I think, in some ways, a more loving parent, because like what I said at the very beginning, like the stuff doesn't matter. Like, you know, I have a lot of the women in that group are overachievers, and were kind of stunned by things that happened to their kids, and there's nothing to do. And even if they had a lot of money, there was nothing to do. And that, you know, it completely transformed their lives. And a lot of people, their friends fell away. Some came up, some fell away, you know, there's all those kinds of things. So yeah, I mean, I feel like if you want parenting advice, go to somebody who's, you know, has a terminally ill kid, and it's not going to be a sob story all the time. Like,
Right.
laugh or die is a phrase for a reason. Like, you know, you have to have a sense of humor, even in that space. And I think I haven't encountered actually one mom in all of my sort of journeys in the last 10 years in the terminally ill kids community who's not like one of the funniest people I've ever met. Like, you know, I mean, just like funny.
Does humor come with the territory, or is it something?
I think it does. I think it does. It's like, I mean, it's the flip side, right? You have to, and also the joy that you have is also exacerbated by the, you know, pit of despair. Like, the further you go down, the further you can go up. I mean, I think that's absolutely true, just in human experience in general.
It's so interesting, Emily. My mom was the funniest person I ever met, or anybody had ever met. But from a lot of grief can come a lot of humor, right?
Yeah, no, and it's like, that's hard one too. I mean, yeah. I mean, I have a friend who is one of my closest friends, and she has, you know, a disability, and her mom died really young of breast cancer. And she literally is so funny. Like, when we get together, it's like it's just shouting, like her husband has to leave the room. He's like, what is wrong? Like, there's two of you now, I can't even deal. So no, I mean, I definitely feel like humor is something you have to lean into. And I think people from the outside don't get that. They're afraid to ask because they're afraid to encounter someone's real emotion, or despair. But despair is part of life. I mean, if we've learned anything from COVID, that's it. Like, chaos is everywhere. Like, it doesn't care. COVID doesn't care.
Right,
Terminal illnesses don't care.
right. Emily, tell us what you mean by dragon parents, those dragon moms.
Oh yeah. Oh, actually, well, then, most of my writing comes when I get mad about something. I don't know what that says about me, but the tiger mom thing, I was like, what? And then someone wrote a panda dad. I was like, what's the panda dad? And then I was thinking about these parents that I had met who were just so fierce and cool and like immediately enveloped you. And there was no question they wouldn't answer. There was no time of day you couldn't call. And they were just like fierce in this way that reminded me of dragons and sort of the mythical dragon, and also the way it had to do with maps, where it's like somewhere you didn't know was called There Be Dragons, because it was like no one knew what was over there. That terrain was unknown, undiscovered. And that it felt really apt to me that's kind of what we were doing. It's like, oh, this parenting territory is not well populated. And we have to be really strong, and be able to do a lot of different things. And, and also it did feel for a long time, it still does, if you tell someone your kid is dying, it's like you've just breathed fire into the room, like conversation stopper. Like, I mean, and then you don't know what to say, and no one knows to say to you. And it's uncomfortable, right? Dragons are messy and they're stinky. So like, I mean, I don't think they exist, but if they were real, that's what they would be.
So Emily, we have a couple of great questions coming
Okay.
in. I want to read to you, all right?
Sure.
Here's from Carrie. Such an amazing and inspirational talk. Emily, can you talk more about how to talk to friends or family members who are grieving? It's hard to find the right words when a loved one is dying or has passed. How can we find the right words or have more options about what to say? I know you have a lot to say about this. You didn't like those greeting cards. A lot of them went in the garbage, I read.
Yes, they did. They did. I don't know, fire greeting cards. I would say that the things that were most helpful to me and that I've found have been the most helpful to all the women that I work with in my writing life and work is this question: how is your grief today? Because it's always changing. It's not just the same every day. Or how are you like, what can I do? And then actually do it. Like, if you are not going to do it, don't say, what can I do? And just say like, how can I support you? Like, that's it. Or just, how is your grief today? That to me was the most helpful thing that anyone said to me. And the second thing that someone said to me was my friend that I was talking to, who's like, the funniest person I know. I would call her and I would tell her these things were happening, and she would just say a single word over and over: awful. Just awful. And it was so great. I was like, yeah, it's awful. Don't try to make it better. Right? Just acknowledge that it's really hard, and that you're around, and you have a net. Those are the things that I think are really powerful to ask, and just to say, like, I'm here if you want to talk, or if you don't want to talk, and whatever you need. And also, I got this tip from one of my lost ladies, so I call my women who are writing through child loss, like, don't expect a thank you note. Just don't. Like, if you send something to someone whose child is terminally ill, please do not expect a thank you note. Like, just don't. That too. But just, how is your grief today?
How was your grief today? That's a good one. We're going to all remember that, Emily. Here's a really nice comment I want to read to you. Your son and my son were born in the same month of the same year. I remember reading your article about Ronan in the New York Times, and it deeply impacted how I chose to raise him and my other children. Although I think about their futures, I don't obsess about them. My son, who turned 11 in March, is on the autism spectrum, and I try to focus on celebrating what he is and what he can do, and appreciating and loving him in every moment, even the difficult ones. I just wanted to thank you for your story.
That's so amazing. I'm so glad that you wrote that. And I'm so happy to know that, actually, because it's why I wrote the book. I mean, I wrote it for people who are struggling with, terminally ill, kids, but I also wrote it for people whose kids aren't sort of the typical kid. And I have a friend, actually, this might be a book that you're interested in. My friend, the poet Matthew Zapruder, wrote a book called Fatherhood about his son on the autism spectrum. And it's so good. Like, I would definitely recommend it. It's powerful. It's just so beautifully written. And it's all the things that you're talking about. But yeah, the future, also the dopey thing about the future is that actually nobody really knows. It's like,
Right.
literally nobody knows.
Well, that's one of the things that I learned from my friend whose son went through 5 rounds of rehab, is while everybody else is worrying about where their kid's going to get into college, she wasn't sure if he would be alive tomorrow. Yeah. And that's really powerful, right? So speaking of which, before the pandemic, we worried a lot, and we still do, about resilience. Mm-hmm. You have a really interesting section in the book about, and I'm not sure whether it was sanctuary or the still point.
Probably sanctuary, yeah.
Probably sanctuary. Could you speak to resilience and what you mean? There was a part where you were talking again about Viktor Frankl's work and how kids in the Holocaust who were writing journals did it with hope, but you can't really be resilient in a certain way if you don't have something, if you don't control your life.
Yeah. Yeah, it requires agency. I mean, yes. There's 2 things. There's 2 parts to that. Like, first of all, resilience is our birthright. Like, people struggle to live through things. Like, if you've ever watched someone die, like, they may want to die in their mind, like they may be ready, and their body's like, nope, we're going to keep trucking, right? Like, we are resilient just by virtue of being who we are in our bodies. There's that. But also it requires agency in the sense of, making decisions, or, how am I going to be a person? And the book that I talk about in Sanctuary is called Salvaged Pages, which is edited by Alexandra Zapruder, who's Matthew's sister. And what's fascinating about those journals is that the writing kept the kids alive, because it was a way of exercising agency in a time when they were everyone was trying to basically annihilate them. Like, yeah. You can't be resilient in a system that's basically like, if someone sees you and identifies you as the enemy, we'll kill you. So their resilience was basically just this basic agency of like, I'm going to write today. And sometimes one sibling would die and the other sibling would take up let's just someone out. Okay. Another sibling would take up the journal and not even say that it was a new writer.
It's incredible.
So the writing was the living, like, just to say, I'm here, to stake a claim, even in the midst of all of this. I don't think that's like resilient, because resilience is a choice, and it's a birthright. So I think it's a combination, but I don't know, like, people are always like, oh, how do you build resilience? And I'm like, well, it's not about building strength. It's not like muscles, it's not that. It's about activating what's already inside you in any way you can. And that could be the smallest thing. Yeah.
That's really beautiful, activating what is already inside you. Mm-hmm. So Emily, we have just about come to the end of our time together. I have one last question for you.
I have to plug my computer in.
Okay. If you could wave your magic wand, what is the one piece of advice you would most like to offer parents?
I would say, like, I don't want to say like enjoy the moment, because I think that's kind of hard to do. But I would just be like, tell them that you love them all the time, even if they don't want to hear it. Like, sometimes Charlie's like, Mommy, like, she doesn't want to hear it. I'm like, the weird old mom at school. It's like shouting out the window, I love you. But I don't care. I am the oldest mom in her school, and I definitely one of the weirdest, and I don't care. I just am like, I love you, and you don't even have to say it back,
I think that's beautiful, Emily. Well, listen, we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
So many wonderful messages today. Looking forward to your next book. And thank you for your time, Emily Rapp Black. Please do look up her books. They're wonderful. Again, I wrote to her when I got to page 10. So it's worth the journey. Thank you so much
for asking me. That was great questions. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
See you soon. Bye-bye, everybody.